Hello, everybody. First of all, thank you to the committee for inviting me to give the talk, and of course yourselves for dialing in. My name is Mathew Martin. I work at the CI Drug Discovery Unit, and today I'm going to talk to you about life after your crystallographic screen and touch on some of the thought processes that we go through here to give us the best chance of developing the fragment hits. So basically we're going to jump in here. After months of optimization, construct design, protein expression, crystallization conditions, etc., all of this hard work comes to fruition when only in a few days we're able to screen our target protein against a small molecule fragment library, which reveals multiple binding events across multiple binding sites with multiple chemical scaffolds. Personally, I've spent hours, days and weeks staring at these magnificent overlays, and they're truly wonderful source of information, not only for drug discovery, but also for mapping the biological functionality of your target surface. As I said, the sensitivity and richness of crystallographic data allows us to identify multiple binding sites, but the question is which one or ones of these are worth progressing. This question in itself deserves probably a whole conference to dissect and discuss. But in the fullness of time, I'm very excited to see how AI can deal with this question and circumvent the huge array of metrics that is capturable from this data. And as I said, it's this huge amount of data that resonates from a crystallographic screen that can help inform basic biology through mapping regions of biological functionality and also revealing potentially uncharted regions. But when entering a crystallographic screen from a drug discovery, it implies you're already in the hit identification stage of a pipeline and that the team has already performed the due diligence of target identification and validation, meaning that you're already in a mind have a site in mind or a region or a specific binding partner that you wish to target. But as you can see from the output of a small molecule fragment screen, it's remarkable how it maps the interactions of known crystallographic captured binding partners of this particular target, which kind of begs the question of how a small molecule screen can actually be useful to inform basic biology. This could be in the shape of a chemical probe, like a degrader or a drug, and then that can be used to probe biological function. And this is an area of technology that we're working on at Newcastle with the DDU, and we hope to share with you in the future. So looking at the preclinical drug discovery pipeline, we can see that we're in the hit identification, and traditionally we would arrive here off the back of some sort of high throughput screen with elaborated hits in the 350, 400 molecular weight affinities in the sort of single digits to tens of micromolar. But fortunately, with technology advances, as Alice explained, we're able to promote crystallography up the cascade and now entering at hit identification. And here we have a different challenge, which is where we're presented with a hit that's likely around 150 molecular weight with affinity towards the sort of millimolar range. But in both cases, we're engaging in SAR and the structure-activity relationship. And for us, we already have the structures. We just need to ascertain the affinity of a fragment against our target protein. And we think of this test cycle as having two components: the chemical design and synthesis, and then the measurement of affinity using a functional plate-based assay or a direct binding method, for example. So building of these assays initially helps to validate the hit, and then you can fit this nicely into a make-test cycle. So these components combine to ensure that every atom is contributing to the overall affinity, with the overarching aim of obviously getting on scale and as fast and as streamlined as possible. Here I'm just flashing up a quick example of a cascade that we would use in a make-test cycle, where you would arrange these techniques into a more formalized manner after hit validation. The team would agree on a hit-to-lead cell-free testing cascade. The example I'm showing you here, where you have a plate-based assay followed by SPR and crystallography, but in reality nowadays with the throughput is that these all run in parallel and where one technique does not gate the other. Then in hit-to-lead, you've got a more formalized cascade and data capture process, where we're able to rapidly increase potency and on-target affinity through targeted medicinal chemistry, but this is based on structurally informed hypothesis. So stepping back a little, now we begin to engage in the structure-activity relationship. And as I said before, we already have the structures. We just need to ascertain an affinity of the fragment against our target. But how do we accurately measure a binding affinity to help guide SAR? And as silly as this sounds, I like to equate this to like the stage is like entering a tunnel, when we refer to it as like the tunnel of uncertainty. And going into any tunnel, you need to have a degree of certainty that you're going to make it out the other end. upon entering the tunnel of uncertainty, and what gives you the confidence that you're going to come out the other end is an arsenal of orthogonal assays. So these orthogonal assays, coupled with continued crystallography, should help provide safe passage through hit validation into hit to lead, taking a millimolar hit into a micromolar derivative of your hit. These orthogonal assays typically fall into three categories, sometimes referred to as triangulation, where you're able to measure a functional measurement, such as activity of a displacement partner protein, which is then coupled to a fluorescent or a luminescence readout, and are ideally suited to low volume plate-based assays. You're able to assess direct binding of your fragment to your target, or through changes in mass or heat exchange upon binding. And then there's obviously the structural determination. In terms of a validated hit, obviously an ideal situation would be that your crystallographic hit be on the scale in both a functional assay and a direct binding assay. But I feel at early stages you can be somewhat flexible and only be on scale in one of the two, with the hope that early compounds based on the hit series come onto scale. So when we talk about triangulation and orthogonal assays, I've listed a few techniques here that we regularly use at the DDU, and they fall into the three categories from the previous slide: the functional based assay, the direct binding, and the structural determination. Obviously, with structural determination, we could absolutely include NMR and cryo-EM, but just for the context of this screen, because it was crystallographic, I've tried to simplify it somewhat, and the same goes for the direct binding techniques. But that being said, there are a number of techniques that you can work up to validate your hit. At this stage, I always advise to be pragmatic and not be afraid to dabble in a good few techniques that may belong to the same category, as you will find that one of the techniques may be useful now to validate your hit and breathe some confidence into the program, but may longer term not be used as part of the formalized make test cascade. You could start with a pragmatic, cheap and dirty thermal shift assay, for example, where your sample protein is the same as the construct used in crystallography, with the only prerequisite that you need it to achieve a stable melt curve. Or ITC with your current construct, also a wonderful option, seen as the gold standard for ligand interactions. For surface plasmon resonance, you can immobilize your current construct through amine coupling, but I believe that you're probably better served with a directional biotinylated tag, for example. But I always feel that the primary driver of a make test cycle is a solid functional plate-based assay, and both fluorescent displacement and activity assays are your pillars here and require a fair degree of optimization and build. I would like to touch on this in the next couple of slides. So if we start to look at working up a functional plate-based assay, as like I said, these are the workhorses of a successful hit-to-lead campaign. At the start of these plate-based assays, you're looking for a functional combination with your target that produces a signal that you can displace with your hit. You're looking to generate a reproducible signal at the lowest possible target concentration of protein and ensure that your competition components are set at their km. These assays need to be a low volume format to increase handling and to reduce costs. But if your target is an enzyme, you may be able to work up an activity assay where it's coupled, where it can be directly coupled to some fashion to a readout in a fluorescence or luminescence. But if your target is a protein-protein interaction, maybe better serve using a directional, a direct fluorescence measurement such as FP. You could measure through changes of rotational speed of the fluorescent ligand once it's bound to the target, or you could use a FRET, which utilizes the energy transfer between the donor and the acceptor molecules that are in close proximity. Or you could use a technique that we favor in the DDU, which is H2F, which combines the standard FRET technology with the time-resolved measurements of fluorescence, which sort of eliminate the short-lived background fluorescence, which can help with some compounds that do fluoresce at the higher concentrations you're working with in fragment discovery. As important as the signal you generate, of course, is how you control the assay. Having a known small molecule is obviously best, but in the world of going after novel targets is not always available. So you should consider building a set of controls through point mutants on your target or substrate, for example, or other proteins that you may have to hand that could act as a negative control. Although this, we won't be touching on compounds at all in this talk, it's wise to point out that as the SAR campaign proceeds, compounds do get larger, and compound solubility and fluorescent interference should be accounted for. Here's a nice little example of H2F assay that took an initial crystallographic hit of a compound then on to scale. And you can see in the middle the H2F setup, and then on the right-hand panel you can see the initial curve of the fragment in pink. Shows that if you extrapolate that to around 3 millimolar, and then an initial analog hit in blue, followed by the fuller curve in green, which gives you a good start point of around 100 micromolar. like I said, given the functional plate-based assay can be the driver of an SAR campaign, you should address a few considerations. We need to bear in mind the pharmacological relevance of your assay design, ensuring that the model is predictive of the functional biological system using a known ligand and activities against a target. You should ensure that the quality of your assay by monitoring like a measure of quality, if you will. For a plate-based assay, you could use a statistical Z prime factor. Z prime has a range of between 0 to 1 with a Z prime around greater than 0.5, considered to be rather good. Reproducibility of the assay is a key requirement within a structural SAR campaign. The assay must be reproducible across batches and within a program that may run for several years and across the duration of an entire drug discovery program, and also with multiple experimenters. As I said, not going to touch on compounds themselves in this talk, but we must consider that their effect on the assay. Typically, they're stored in organic solvents such as DMSO, therefore the assay must be configured to concentrations of DMSO that you typically use. And finally, the costs associated with this, so performing an assay in a 384 or 1536 well is best, alongside aliquoting your batches. Now moving on to quickly look at direct binding, the third component of this triangulation of techniques. I'm highlighting the two techniques that we commonly use in the DDI, but as I said earlier, there's a number of other ones that can play an important role in assessment of direct binding within an SAR campaign. Firstly, surface plasmon resonance, very powerful technique, as the SPR signal is directly proportional to the change in mass of your hit and can be used to determine the KD of your interaction. Although SPR is deemed label-free, you do have to immobilize your target to the SPR surface, then pass over the concentration titration of your hit over the surface, and from the characteristics of the sensogram, you can calculate the association-dissociation constants. I find that coupling your SPR experiment with an acoustic dispenser like an echo really reduces the solvent bulk effect associated with the solvent from your hit titration and does allow for tighter data. As I said earlier, ITC is seen as the gold standard for measuring ligand interactions, as the change in heat observed is directly proportional to the energy associated with inhibitor binding. With fragments, however, we typically operate under low C-value conditions where we need a very high concentration of hit in the syringe to drive equilibrium to the bound state. So this is more attainable with fragments, obviously, because they're smaller, more improved solubility. But under low C, we're only able really to fit effectively from the far right of the thermogram, the inflection and saturation, as long as we know the number of binding sites which we get from the crystal structure. But both these techniques do come a little trickier when you have to interpret multiple binding sites of greater than one. Again, regarding controlling this, it's best to have a small molecule, but again, consider building a set of controls through point mutants and substrates and other negative control proteins that you may have in hand. Here are a couple of nice examples of direct binding. On the left, an SPR run where on a flow cell 1, we have a blank. On the other 3, we immobilize with our target in green, our target with a functional mutant in red, and a family member of this target in blue. And then we've run a multi-cycle run here where we flowed a series of concentrations over the 4 flow cells. And you can see nicely the hit binding, although weakly, to the target, and the well-controlled using the other proteins. On the right is a thermogram from a low C-value ITC run, where you can see that we were able to fit a KD of around 2.5 millimolar, knowing that there's only one binding event from the crystal structure. And I just want to briefly round this off, looking at techniques by providing some additional considerations, which I hope would serve you well coming into this as a PhD student or postdoc. Obviously, building controls is vital. You can identify a control from your hit series that you can rely on through the campaign eventually. But as I'm probably a half glass full person sometimes, I would encourage you that make the most of your data, at least initially in the project, where extrapolation of data slightly to build a little bit of early confidence and seed some initial additional chemistry can really help get a project moving. But also understand that you may need to use different techniques at different stages in the campaign, where the technique you validate your hit from may not serve purpose in the full make test. I always encourage you to be pragmatic and make the most of what's around you in your lab. Regarding reagents and other lab wares, use knowledge of other experiences that you have with your target, such as the buffering and purification or the DMSO tolerance in your crystallization to help inform you. With regards to assay output, really cannot stress how important capturing your data is. I don't mean this in the form of an Excel spreadsheet, although obviously that helps at times. I mean in some form of LIMS system where you can access your SAR data, and you'll be able to find this so important when it comes to the hundreds of compounds that your project does actually bring. And obviously, please report uniformly. Finally, and I mean this in a kind of jovial nature, but befriend your chemist. In the same way that you know your target and you purified it and crystallized it, etc., your chemist will know the chemistry behind the hit series or series, and could really inform you certain bits of QC that will help. Plus, you're part of a team, and we all want to arrive at the same thing, which is an inhibitor in a timely fashion, certainly. And this all certainly helps with good relations in a team. Lastly, finally, I'd like to show you a template for a cascading capture, which is a sort of form which make test cycle advances a hit chemical series. This cycle, as you can see, should enable productive SAR process, given you're able to capture your data effectively and is readily available to the team during the analysis and design stage. Combining these techniques to inform the decision making helps us reach our goal of increasing potency and on-target affinity. And with that, I'd like to finally thank the team at Newcastle. Here's a picture of the CRUK Newcastle Drug Discovery team in kinder times. And they said they're a great bunch of folk drawn from an eclectic mix of chemists, biologists, protein scientists, led by Professors Steve Wedge, Martin Noble, and Mike Waring. And the greater structural biology team, co-led by Professor Jen Endicott, are grateful for the wonderful resource, which is the Newcastle Structural Biology Lab, ably manned by Arno Ballet. And I'd like to give a special thanks to the PhD student Ian Hope for sharing with me his crystallographic screening data that I used in the introduction. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Matthew, for